Hello, hello everyone. Welcome to our first workshop in this series, and thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate the contribution so far. I think there will be people who'll be joining us right after this. I think there's supposed to be more, but it's okay. If they miss some parts of the slides, they could always go back and refer to the slides. Okay, so I realized that there is a huge range of debaters who sign up for this. I think there are people who are sort of relatively new to debating. There are also some who are a bit more experienced. To be honest, when I wrote these slides, I initially tried to target probably people who are intermediate or higher. And to be fair, I was also thinking about older students when I was writing this. But that's fine. There are moments that might be a bit heavy. And if you think that it's something I need to slow down and explain, or there's something that is um, something that I take for granted and you might not know and require me to sort of like go deeper into it, I'm more than happy to sort of like explain it. But let's start anyway. So for today's workshop, we're going to talk about whether the developing world should nationalize their resources. I'll go deeper into the meaning, what I mean by nationalizing a bit later. And I will characterize things that are not that intuitive with this question. But if you were to take a look at this question is practically um, a modification on a motion that is sort of related to this. But before we get into that, a bit of a disclaimer. Even though this is a meta session, I want everyone to sort of like understand that meta alone is not enough for you to win a debate. There are not surefire ways to win debates around this. But I do hope the things that I talk about in this session sort of like help you go deeper into the related topics and everything. And when you use the information related in the slides, you would still have to provide a certain context in it. Of course, there are similar principles that you could um, sort of like place in a different debate, but you could still work around things and you could still change a bit of the context to make sure that it's more suitable with the debate that you are having at that. And I'm sorry. Okay, never mind. And thirdly, now, while I understand that when it comes to matter, it's important, the basics of debating is still the most important part, your structure, whatsoever. So I guess when it comes to intermediate debaters, there's a tendency of just, reading up a lot of manner or, taking up a lot of this information, thinking they could use everything and they just method dump everything. While that can be useful, at the end of the day, you are still talking to humans who need a way to process that information and so on. Okay, so let's put aside that disclaimer. Now, for today's topic, to be honest, I primarily centered whatever I wrote surrounding this specific motion. This house believes that developing nations or developing countries with substantial natural resources should nationalize natural resource production. So the reason why I decided to pick this motion is because it's one of those motions where a lot of the principles is applicable in a wide range of debates. Because while this debate is about natural resources, there can be a lot of other debates about governments owning things and so on. And when we are talking about natural resources and the developing world, I think there is a lot of context that you can learn from this specific motion that applies to debates outside how you would normally imagine most debates would be, because most debates we tend to imagine them happening in a much more developed country context, Western liberal democracies and so on. So having a workshop surrounding developing countries sort of like help us to sort of like peel back things that we also take for granted outside of what most debate motions are. But anyway, so to tackle that motion, I decided to sort of like decided that these are some of the questions that I should try to answer in these slides. Of course, I won't go into super technical detail for everything here and so on, but these are like the rough general areas that I think that's related to the motion that I mentioned earlier. So the way I derive all of these questions is by observing what are the main keywords within the motion, and how do I then convert them into these questions. So let's take, for example, the key words for this motion here: developing countries, substantial resources, and nationalization, and natural resource production, along those lines, etc. Um, so when we have those specific keywords, we can then convert them into questions that can be used as starting point for you to figure out either A, your principles, or what kind of information you eventually need. And if you are preparing on your own, figuring out motions whatsoever, that could be the basis of where you could start reading for that specific topic itself. Okay, so if I were to be for this motion, then I'm for the idea of developing nations nationalizing their resources. There are four rough areas I would talk about. Firstly, I would try to analyze what is the interest of developing countries and why their interests are probably very different from what developed countries actually have, and so on. Number two, I will talk about what do substantial natural resources look like? How does it look like when you have an abundance of it in some sense? And this is where I'm going to talk a bit about different examples related to it. Thirdly, what does nationalization look like? And I think this is one of the bigger questions that people have in this specific motion. And that's a core part of what the question of the workshop that I'm trying to answer here today. And within that, I'm going to talk about how developing countries benefit from this nationalization. And fourthly, I'm going to talk about what happens when we don't nationalize, and what happens when when things are within private hands, or in most cases foreign entities. To be honest, though when it comes to foreign entities, indirectly you could say that in some sense private hands, and so and when it comes to arguing against this motion, I think there are two key areas that I'll probably try to touch on. And the first one is the process of nationalization. So this question has something slight, there's a slight nuance to it in comparison to just talking what does nationalization look like. But the process of nationalization also includes the political atmosphere, the political environment surrounding certain things. And I'll explain how that is eventually good for, or good or bad for developing countries and so on. And the second area I'm going to talk about when I'm arguing against this motion is this whole question on whether developing countries can actually carry it out in the first place. Can they actually follow through when it comes to nationalization? If yes, how do they actually work things out? How does that expropriation actually look like in itself? And will this actually cause more problems eventually, and so on? And will it actually be meaningful to these developing countries? How would foreign investors view these countries if that is the case, if they don't respect property rights, if the nationalization is one of those nationalizations where they, take all the assets from people instead. But anyway, these are the general areas to it. Okay, so part one, what are developing countries and what do they want? And I'll explain a bit later why do I need to go in depth in explaining all these key terms, because sometimes you might take it for granted about all of this. But anyway, when it comes to developing countries, the reality is that there is no real single agreed upon definition on what is a developing countries. But there is like a rough idea in the popular imagination of what is a developing country. And more often than not, when people say a country is a developing country, it normally refers to less sophisticated economies. So it normally means economies that are less reliant on things like the service sector. They're probably involved in manufacturing, but a huge chunk of it is probably extraction. So they're not super complicated economies throughout the process. And It's normally a reference to, let's be honest, countries outside of the high income category. So we are mainly talking about countries that are of the middle to lower income itself. So again, because there is no single definition and it can be quite vague, the spectrum is actually huge. So this is important in debating because it allows a lot of room for, for your characterization of developing countries and how they react to things, or if they are able to carry out these actions instead. And then you also have issues of countries that self-declare to be developing countries. And there are quite a number of countries that are technically high income, but they still view themselves as developing because of their location as a peripheral nation, or probably because there is still huge income inequality within the country, or the country is just huge, that you have a huge diversity of people from very different income levels. I think a great example of this dispute is a country like China, where you have tier one cities that are very well developed, but by the time you leave the tier one cities and you go in the middle of rural China, I'm not going to mention names, but basically these places are not as developed as Beijing or all the other cities that are way more developed in comparison, and there is a lot of attention by the government in itself. Another country that tries to self-declare that they are a developing country is probably Qatar. So it's kind of odd that Qatar is quite rich, they can host the World Cup, but they don't see themselves at the same level as there's Western developed countries and so on. And I think there are times where Singapore, despite being a rich nation that is heavily involved in the shipping industry, export trades, import and exports, and they have a really good location that they could exploit. They imagine themselves as not being as powerful economically or culturally, politically, in comparison to a country, let's say, like the Netherlands. So the reason why they are able to self-declare and why it actually means anything is because the World Trade Organization, which is the organization that sort of like facilitates trade in the world, and also like tries to negotiate things in behalf or try to make sure that people come to common terms if they were to have a dispute. And developing nations has certain protected statuses that the WTO will acknowledge. For example, exemption to things like anti-dumping laws or along those things, or exemptions to protectionism and so on, that countries would want access to. So even though they might be relatively rich, the status of a developing country is still quite valuable, even though some people might have very different imaginations of what is a developing economy. Okay, so that's the context of a developing country, but I'm going to put that aside because while that is useful, it is not zeroed into the debate yet. But another angle that we need to talk about, and I think this will help us figure out arguments for this debate, is to understand why these countries are developing in the first place. More often than not, it's because they face different hardships or obstacles when it comes to income or human development. I'll explain later why I put human development as a separate thing. But basically, there's a huge spectrum. If you agree there's a huge spectrum of what it means to be a developing country, then there's also a huge spectrum on why they are developing in the first place. So the first one, which is probably the most relevant to the motion that we are discussing today, is that there is a lack of control over natural resources or lack of talent to exploit these natural resources, or the lack of natural resources in general. And when I say lack of control over natural resources, this includes several things: the actual exploitation of the natural resources, the lack of control, as in like the lack of control over the companies and the mechanisms related to it, but also the lack of control when it comes to the revenue from or derived from these natural resources in the first place. That's probably one of the more relevant ones to more relevant reason to our workshop today. The second reason why countries are still developing is because they're at the peripheries, as in like they are far away or not the interest of high income nations, that people can basically ignore them, that no matter how they try to run their country, they find it hard to establish similar interests with more developed nations, and also as engage with their markets, having access to it, importing and export and so on, or they're not close enough to leverage their currency or economy, that sort of like pushes them away from that status in the first place. The third category is that these are countries that are experiencing conflict, or they are recovering from conflict. So they're post-conflict societies, but they just recovered from it, or they have a hard time recovering from it, probably because the death of a lot of talent during the war, or the lack of young able-bodied people as a consequence of conflicts or wars, that makes it harder for them to exploit the human talent that exists within their countries instead. Or the fourth reason is the underinvestment, which is related to the debate we'll be talking about today. The lack of industrialization in general, or it's just that they're just unlucky because of the high barrier of development, maybe because of geography, because of their environment. So, for example, when it comes to Egypt, it looks like a huge country if you were to look at a map, but the only places where they could develop their nation is surrounding the Nile. So the country effectively becomes denser. They have less arable land in comparison to how one would imagine according to the size of the nation. And they are very dependent on countries like Ethiopia, because the Nile comes from Ethiopia in the first place, that it makes it hard for them to become developed, despite the rich history that they have. It's practically sheer bad luck in some sense, and that forces the income inequality within that. So despite the fact that I mentioned all of these factors, it does not mean that these factors are exclusive. These factors can also compound each other, that makes it hard for them to become proper developed nations within that process itself. So these are the main reasons why these countries are developing. And if we are able to figure this out, it's easier for us to figure out arguments that are related to it later from this understanding. All right, so let's try to zero into the context of this debate. Despite a huge range of it, we're talking about developing countries who are in the privilege of making the choice on whether to nationalize or not. So there are several characteristics that we can sort of like derive from these kind of nations. The first one is that these are countries that have resources, but they don't have substantial control. That's the first thing that we're going to establish. And that's why nationalization becomes the question here. Number two, most of these resources are probably owned by non-citizens or private entities. So there's huge income inequality in that sense then. And it's not owned by the government that is supposed to work for you. So there are a lot of reasons why these entities hold on to them or have control over them. I think the first one is related to what we argued earlier, is about underinvestments. So there are places that just don't have the capital, unfortunately. I think a great example of this, initially Saudi Arabia didn't have the capital to exploit their resources, so they managed to talk to different foreign entities like I forgot it's an American company, but we'll go to that later. But basically, they have greater they have eventual greater control over the production of resources within its nations. And because of that, they are able to control what the nation would have wanted to control that. So there's a lot of complications in ownership due to history from it. And then you have nations that are former colonies. And because in the past, when you have colonial governments and they give out concessions to people who are who they favor from. So let's say, for example, in countries like Botswana, you would have Germans running the mines, and not Botswana, Zambia, you have Germans running the mines. Or in the case of South Africa, you also have white people running them, whatever. But the whole point is that it allows them to sort of like control all of these resources, and they have monopoly over these resources then. So that would eventually make it harder for nations to have a say what to do with this kind of things instead, right? Okay, so if we were to zero into the context of the debate, these are basically countries that don't have substantial control over resources, but they have the privilege to make this decision eventually. Okay, so considering all of that, let's try to analyze what would be the interest of these developing countries and what can we prioritize so that we can eventually use that to figure out what arguments or what kind of impacts that we might want to care on or focus on eventually. So the interest for developing countries, they can be very different from developed countries. I'm not saying that developed countries don't have the same interests here, but their interests, when it comes to developing countries, this is a bigger priority, I guess. So the first one is probably less reliance on foreign talent or foreign capital, especially if you are arguing for nationalization, saying that you don't want to rely on other people hogging most of the jobs that teaches technical skills is a really good reason for why nationalization should be the case. So someone might argue that nationalization would mean that these people would go away. People who are technically skilled, they might come from developed nations, they would go back. And you could say that, this is a risk that we are willing to take. This is a trade-off that we want to experience because we want most of the exploitation of our resources to be done by our local talent, and local talent will be able to learn from that, and eventually that builds up the technological base within that country itself. So you build up local talent, and eventually you are able to invest in infrastructure and also the human development and so on. The problem with relying on nationalization is that you are relying on foreign companies to exploit your natural resources is that, number one, there is no guarantee that they would invest in local issues or the social welfare of people, because there is no guarantee that they would actually reap the rewards from it. So they don't think in those terms. Of course, they are who give scholarships and so on, but it's not a huge priority. So they'll probably just do enough. But also at the same time, but also at the same time, when you are so reliant on other countries exploiting your economy or building off your economy, then you are on the lower end of the supply chain when it comes to economics in general, because they would extract resources from you,
But that's the only value that they get, because most of the value that is created from the products are from the end product itself. So if let's say you have oil in a country and this foreign entities extract it, they're probably going to use their own manufacturing base. So wherever it is, they're going to export it there, and they make more money on top of that, rather than just from the actual product, the actual resource. So your value in the chain is actually lower if you only rely on natural resource. And it's kind of hard for you to have all the additional layers of value if you don't control the natural resource in the first place, because they will just see you as part of the chain, and they have no interest in making sure that you are able to develop. Because if it's cheaper for them to do things back home, or cheaper for them to ship off these raw materials into a third country, they will probably do that instead. So whatever you sell from this will not be meaningful. And not only that, a huge chunk of the profit goes into the companies that does this extraction in the first place. The next reason why some countries would, want to pursue the next interest that they may have would probably be nation building and sovereignty. If most of the resources are owned by people from different countries, then there is a sense of inferiority that locals would have. So let's say, for example, if I am from a poor village and I see most of the economic development going into large companies, these MNCs or these multinational corporations would always be viewed as an entity that's so far away, I don't belong here, and so on. So it's not actually good for the health of that nation if it's always owned by somebody else and there is no local faces becoming the face of these companies instead. So there are foreign companies that are able to sort of like localize, but there's an upper limit when it comes to localization of your company services and so on. So eventually, ownership through nationalization would be the better way for you to carry this out and so on. All right, so the reason why we identify and characterize all of that in detail, especially for motions like this, it's because it helps us to debate within specific contexts. We meet the interests of who these stakeholders actually are, and in this case, it's developing nations. So it helps you focus the debate and helps you achieve very specific set of goals, and it teaches you how to make certain trade-offs. So if your goal, let's say, is to focus on the development of local talent, and we are willing to forego foreign talent, and we're willing to forego some investments who might be scared of, then you could say that we don't care, because the end goal eventually is building the nation, making sure that we have the skills in order for us to develop ourselves rather than rely on other countries. If you want to do business with us, you can do it in different sectors of the economy, which we don't mind you exploiting. But for natural resources, we want greater control of it instead. Okay, so this then leads to part two. What do substantial natural resources eventually look like? And who owns a lot of these resources now? And I guess this is what I'm going to talk a bit about privatization in this process, or how private companies control a lot of these things instead. Okay, so what do we mean by substantial resources? So like I said earlier, this normally means that the country's economy isn't complex. So we're talking about countries that are very dependent on natural resources like timber or whatever it is, and so on. And it's fair for us to assume that most of these countries are not heavily reliant on things like finance, manufacturing, or etc. So what does this mean then? It means that, number one, working in these industries is a huge part of the economy or identity of the nation. I think a great example of this would probably be in places like Malaysia. Working in the oil and gas sector is a huge part of the nation's economy, or in places like Brunei, because they're so reliant on oil in general, that when you think of someone who is successful within a country, you would imagine them working in the oil and gas sector in itself. But the second thing that I think that we point out is that the reason why we need to talk about the substantial resources is that the exploitation of these resources is more meaningful than investing in other parts of the economy. So it means that if you don't take control of these resources, you are losing out a lot of things eventually, because all of the other parts of the economy, no matter how much you invest them, it wouldn't be as profitable as going for the substantial resource in itself. But thirdly, and I think this is sort of like the third thing that is under-analyzed by a lot of debaters when they're arguing about natural resource, is that if you are arguing for nationalization, the characterization that could help you a lot is to explain how other countries rely on the nations with substantial resources more than a country with substantial resources relying on the other countries to manufacture them. So let's say, for example, you control 70% of a specific mineral in the world. Other countries would have to pander to you because they cannot find other alternatives, or other alternatives are too small that it requires a lot of work. So let's say you control a resource for 70% and you have 30% left. The remaining 30% might be broken down into 14 different nations. So there's a possibility that you have to go through the regulatory framework of other 14 more nations, and corporations don't want to go through that or experience that. It's really hard for companies to juggle all of it. So what they will do is to pander to what you need, or eventually listen through with what you have. So even if you were to nationalize, they can't immediately say that, oh, wait a minute, we don't want to work with you anymore. They eventually require what you have. If you have lithium, they eventually need it instead. Right. So this leads to the first example that I want to talk about when it comes to substantial resources. So most of lithium in this world is within the lithium triangle in South America. And we're talking about countries like Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina is 17 million tons. And Bolivia has the largest lithium reserves in the world. And Bolivia actually went through a process of nationalization. And they realized that they can do this because the rest of the world needs them more than them needing the rest of the world. So lithium is really important when it comes to things like batteries and a lot of other electronic products. So if the world wants to continue manufacturing for it, then they have to listen to the demands of Bolivians or the Bolivian government. And if they want to work or exploit the resources there, they probably have to go through a state-owned company, or there are many more layers that they actually have to go through, and they're willing to go through that because you have a huge chunk of it instead. So as things like the EV industry, the electric vehicle industry were to grow, lithium would only become more important, and more people would eventually pander to your needs or follow through with what you demand in the first place. Right. So the second example that I want to talk about is Morocco. So, and this is a natural resource I think a lot of people underplay, because when most people talk about natural resource, they think about oil or ore in general, but they don't think of things like fertilizers. And phosphate is a key component when it comes to fertilizers. And Morocco realized this recently. I forgot when exactly, probably a recent decade or something. They possess 70% of the world's phosphate rock reserves, and the remaining ones, I think, are in China and a bunch of other Central Asian countries, if I'm not mistaken. So you really need phosphate to make fertilizers. So imagine this. You are a country that's very reliant on agriculture. There is only an upper limit on how you can grow agriculturally, if you don't have fertilizers, you don't have enough places to source phosphate from in order for you to have mass agriculture. So no matter how secure is your agricultural industry, you still need fertilizers, and there is no real alternative to phosphorus at this point. No one has found other alternatives. So for example, like in the past, when it comes to rubber, there is an alternative to rubber, so people can say goodbye to all the tropical countries that supplied rubber in the first place. But you can't do that when it comes to fertilizers and so on. And here's the interesting part, that all this while, when it comes to the manufacturing of fertilizers, Morocco would have exported it, exported phosphate in order for them to gain value and so on. But they realized that if they invest in turning the value of their raw materials into something that is much more valuable, then they would get a near monopoly of the fertilizer industry in the future. So other countries that that need agriculture or rely on agriculture eventually have to buy fertilizers from Morocco if they control a huge monopoly of it in this world. So yeah, so that the rest of the world needs to pander to Morocco, then Morocco pandering to the rest. And that characterization will help with your argument for nationalization. The third example I want to point out is crude oil. And I think this is the example most people are more familiar with. In 2020, Russia was the largest exporter of crude oil. And only recently, Saudi Arabia took over as the largest exporter. And that is mainly because of the Russian and Ukraine conflict. So it means that if things went fine and dandy, Russia would still be the largest contributor to things instead. So despite this conflict, it still shows that Europe is still quite reliant on Russia. They couldn't let go of dependency because Germany closed down a bunch of power plants. They moved away from nuclear power plants because the Green Party made it a huge issue after the Fukushima power plant disaster in 2011 and so on. So then they had to move back to oil, coal, whatever they need from Russia in itself. And this is where Europe is sort of like captured by all of it, especially since the war happened over the winter at one point, and they need a lot of energy to heat up their home. So they really can't give that up in that process. But on top of that, Russia has expanded to a lot of other markets. I think the most important one is a fellow member of the BRICS Alliance, BRIC. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But anyway, they managed to turn to India, despite the fact that India is quite a close ally to the West when it comes to Russia. But India still thinks from their perspective, because let's be fair, it's kind of unfair for them to only think about the West and their interests. They eventually have to cater to their own people, and they need cheap oil, and they saw that opportunity. And Russia was like, this is a way for us to plug in losses that we've had from Europe all this while because of the war. India is now a new friend. I mean, they've been close friends, but India, I guess, is a closer friend at this point with this example of crude oil. So, okay, but let's zero into the context of this debate. So as useful as those three examples are initially, we also have to understand that this debate is still talking about a range. So the examples that we've spoken about earlier are examples of nations that have substantial control that provides them near monopoly over the products, that forces other nations to sort of like pander to their regulations or whatever they need, and they're more than happy to work with their nationalization process. But this debate is not only concerned about them, it's also about other smaller nations who might also make that decision or might have to experience that, that decision in general. And they might also be inclined to nationalize throughout the process itself. Okay, but since we've spoken about examples of countries that have managed to, not managed to nationalize, but more like have substantial control over their natural resources, I think it's only fair that we talk about private and foreign ownership in developing countries just to see the examples related to it. Oh wait, yeah, yeah, we'll talk about that a bit later. All right, okay. Part 3. So what does nationalization look like in this process? So I think this is what most of you are attracted to when you saw the title of the workshop. So nationalization is the process of converting a privately owned, and in most cases, and let's admit it, foreign companies into government-owned companies, or you have the assets transferred to government hands in that sense. So a great example of this would probably how do people know the car brand Renault from France? It used to be a private entity, but then eventually it was nationalized. But anyway, there are several ways nationalization could happen. It could be a change in ownership. So rather than being owned just by private entities, the government would probably force them to give up ownership in that sense. So there are multiple ways it could work. Is that the government writing legislation that's related to it, or maybe the company is involved in some criminal proceeding or involved in some legal battles, so they convert the ownership towards the government instead. The second way this could happen when it comes to nationalization is that sometimes companies get into trouble and they require someone to save them out. Maybe they cannot rely on banks giving them money because the risk is too high. But also at the same time, probably these companies provide a lot of jobs and a lot of people are reliant on them. Probably they're too big to fail. That's a phrase normally used on banks, by the way. So governments might offer them bailouts. They say that, well, if you want to be safe, we will put in money, but you have to transfer ownership to us, or you have to follow certain conditions if you want to operate. So a great example of this would probably be General Motors in the United States. But it does not mean the government is heavily involved all the time. More often than not, when it comes to bailouts, it's the government giving them conditions. But if there is a transfer of ownership and what people call backdoor nationalization, the government might still want to retain the brand value that the company has. So they might sort of like stay away. They may have some dictates, but they still stay away from the decision-making process within it. Okay, so that's the second example. The third example is a transfer of assets into a state-owned company, right? So what this basically means is that this is when governments write into legislation for where exactly certain resources actually go to. So let's say, for example, a government writing into legislation saying that all the gold in a certain land now belongs to the state. So foreign companies can no longer mine gold. They have to work with a local company that has been nationalized, or they are given license, or they get outsourced when it comes to trust and so on. And fourthly, joint public-private cooperation. So sometimes a government may hold a monopoly, or a company may hold a monopoly over certain resources because it's written into the law. But it does not mean that all of these foreign companies disappear. They are still privately owned. You still have foreign owned, but they have to work with licenses. So you want to mine a certain product, or sorry, a certain resource in a certain district, we are going to give you the license instead, but you have to apply through us. But the whole point here is that it gives greater control for the government, and it allows governments to put in more regulations, or governments are able to get revenue on top of what people do within that. Okay. Now, what kind of countries are more likely to carry out nationalization? Oh yeah, before I forget, when it comes to nationalization, um, I think there is a slight nuance between nationalization and companies that are state-owned from the get-go. So when it comes to companies that are state-owned from the get-go, I think foreigners would have already expected that to be the way how people conduct business in these countries. So when they enter it, they are entering it according to the terms and conditions of what the country has set. They are not being antagonized. But when it comes to the process of nationalization, like let's say taking assets or forcing companies who were originally independent to follow certain regulations or to follow certain dictates, then there is a thought process that people experience, or these companies experience, thinking that, well, they are the ones who are being chased out despite the hard work that they put in. But anyway, let's go back to this. Who's more likely to do a nationalization? So countries like China or other countries with state-owned enterprises, they have like state-owned enterprises. That's a whole different thing. But when it comes to nationalization, it's probably more like a more recent development instead. So we're talking about countries like Bolivia with leaders like Evo Morales that decided to nationalize parts of the lithium industry instead. Or more recently, the successor to Evo Morales, that is Lucia Arce, same political party, by the way, who managed to continue that nationalization itself. Or you have other more negative examples, I guess, when it comes to Venezuela with Hugo Chavez and the state of Venezuela today. But more often than not, we're talking about countries who have left-wing politics, who believe that workers should probably own more of the company or have a greater control over the company rather than having them within private hands instead. More often than not, these are countries that has a strong need for redistribution. So let's say, for example, a country that doesn't have that much of income inequality, nationalization is probably not the priority. Or if it is the priority, it is not because of economic terms. It's probably because of, I don't know, some kind of nationalism, I guess, itself, which leads to the next one. Countries that have some kind of resource nationalism, where they feel proud of the resources within that country. They would want to have greater control over it, and they don't want a foreign entity to control what they feel proud of, probably because the resources have given them a lot of power and income or revenue within that process in itself. Or fourthly, it's when that foreign or private ownership is about to fail, and the state needs to come in to make sure that people don't automatically get fired and eventually condemning the economics of that area. Or if there are a lot of harms that might happen, this is where the government might eventually come in and take greater control of things. All right, so let's talk about several examples of nationalization. I think one of the more important examples is actually Pemex, which is a Mexican company. The company was formed in 1938, so it's actually quite old in that sense. However, in 1938, I forgot what's the name of the president at that point, Kiandras or something, Cardedras. But someone could try to fact check me on that and figure that out. But anyway, in 1938, they wrote a constitutional amendment saying that all oil in Mexico belonged to the state. So in that period, American companies no longer have exclusive rights for that oil. And they were not happy, of course, and they have to figure out something from it. So, but this was pre-World War II. So in that situation, Pemex then owned all the rights to drilling, extraction, and all the other activities surrounding it. So Mexico is able to exploit this and so on. And this is part of their resource nationalism, because they feel proud from, controlling the oil industry, because it gives them a lot of revenue, and they want their people to hold important positions within this instead. It is so important that this is actually the day this happened is actually a public holiday in Mexico, March 18th, that they actually respect that in that sense. And it's part of how they feel to be Mexican in itself. But of course, there are a lot of negative impacts from this on top of the good ones. For example, there was a boycott initially when it comes to Pemex nationalizing, or I guess the term that they used was expropriation. That's more like the legal term that they use, because they viewed anyone holding onto or having a monopoly on these resources to be going against the law. So expropriation is the legal term to take something on behalf of the state if there is a court proceeding that's related to it. So, but anyway, the boycott eventually went away because people need oil. And also this happened before World War II. So during World War II, there is a huge need for oil and people can't say no to Mexico and they eventually have to disappear. So yeah, so that's an example of that, a form of nationalization that sort of worked. Eventually, Mexico became less strict and eventually allowed other entities to work with Pemex if Pemex isn't able to fully capitalize on what they have access to in the first place. All right, a second example would be Saudi Aramco, which is one of the largest crude oil companies to ever exist in this world. And it's partially owned by the Saudi government. So in the 1950s, Saudi Aramco nearly became 100% government. But the government threatened the company, and the company eventually acquiesced to the government. They eventually followed through with what the government eventually wanted. But they still gave some degree of independence, but it led to a 50-50 profit sharing. So the Saudi government still owns a lot and so on. And then eventually the Saudi government controlled more of the company. But I think the reverse is also happening now where they start selling shares or whatever it is. But a huge chunk of the company is under the observation of the Ministry of Petroleum and Mineral Resources. So even though Saudi Aramco has some kind of quote-unquote independence and so on, it is still something that requires government observation and somebody to sort of like approve things, I guess, in that sense. But anyway, this was the model that Venezuela wanted to follow at first, but eventually Venezuela went on with full ownership instead. Okay, so those two are examples of nationalization. So let's talk about an example that is closer to home for me, I guess. And this is Petronas. Well, technically, this is not nationalization because it's a state-owned company from the get-go. But the benefits of a state-owned company and the principles surrounding that when it comes to debate can be used in a debate about nationalization. So the interesting thing about Petronas is that despite it being a company, the company is directly answerable to the Prime Minister of Malaysia. So whoever becomes the leader of Malaysia can ask questions to Petronas and they are expected to answer. So it's almost as if that the Prime Minister owns, I mean, not directly owned, but they have like the ability to question this and that whatsoever. So in the case of Malaysia, there is quite a heavy reliance on Petronas when it comes to revenue. So if you were to take a look at how Malaysia does its budgeting every year, it's also quite dependent on the ups and downs of what Petronas experience, because it's a huge chunk of the country's GDP. But it also shows that the country stand to lose out if a huge chunk of the natural resources are controlled by companies like Shell, we do still have Shell in Malaysia, but imagine if Shell controlled everything, Malaysia wouldn't be able to tap into that revenue that Petronas has. But there's still a lot of controversy when it comes to revenue. There's another problem when the government has a greater control of revenue, where the revenue goes also becomes a political question, because there are ownership dispute over resources, over who actually owns what, to what extent the federal government actually owns something. An example of this would be how Sabah Sarawak, for those who are not Malaysians here, Sabah Sarawak are Malaysian states on the eastern side. So if you were to take a look at a map, Malaysia is divided into two. You have West Malaysia, which is attached to the mainland, and it's a peninsula. And on the right or to the east, you have Sabah Sarawak, and that's a huge gap. So a huge chunk of oil revenue come from these states, but these states are also relatively underdeveloped in comparison. So this is where the Sarawakian government isn't happy with the federal government in a lot of things. And this is where they eventually started their own company, because they don't want to deal things through Petronas instead, and that's Petros. And they use that to sort of like move up the ranks. And I guess eventually they aim to become like Petronas, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 years down the road. Let's see how far Petros goes. Okay, considering all of that, we've spoken about the general context of this debate motion so far. Let's talk about some of the arguments eventually that we can use, that we can align with all the interests and the examples and the context we spoke about earlier. So these are arguments that you could argue from the perspective of government bench in the first place. Why nationalization? Within the context of natural resources, of course. The first one, most obvious one, is that you have increased control over revenue. That you have private or foreign entities that might prioritize their owners first, rather than the country that they are operating in instead. And there is no guarantee they would spend money into more meaningful things within a country. They will probably prioritize exports instead. And revenue goes into the pockets of a small group of people in comparison. But number two, they are less likely to develop local talent. I'm not saying that they don't, but the problem is that they only build infrastructure what they need. They won't invest in things that require long-term planning. So for example, when it comes to education in rural areas that are far away from their oil extraction, that's probably less of a priority. But if you nationalize, you don't have to worry about them paying taxes. You don't have to worry about what revenue you get from them, because you control the revenue. So the money gets into social welfare as quickly as possible. Now, I understand that Venezuela is not the best example of things, but there are a lot of reasons why Venezuela failed. But Venezuela did manage to put a lot of money from nationalization into their welfare. Okay, I don't know why I used Venezuela immediately, but I forgot about the Nordic countries. So the Nordic countries put a lot of money into their social welfare. They put their money into a sovereign wealth fund, which means that they don't use the money straight away, but they invest the money that they get from the nationalization, the revenue from nationalization, into the sovereign wealth fund. And then they invest in all other businesses abroad. They get their money back, and that money goes into their social welfare. And that's how they're able to sustain the welfare state in countries like Norway, Iceland, and so on. And this is an opportunity for countries with resources to sort of like not gamble away all their money, but put back into a sovereign wealth fund and eventually develop the nation in that process. Again, you don't have to worry about taxes and them lobbying when it comes to taxes. You control the revenue anyway. And also when you have greater control over revenue, You can also temper how much revenue you want to prioritize versus the social impact of things. So let's say, for example, you are willing to forego some extraction projects if it were to negatively affect indigenous groups. In that situation, a private entity would probably try to get into that and ignore the social impact of things. But a government that experienced nationalization, they have an incentive in making sure that the social impact is also respected as equally as the revenue. So you could work around that profit, whatever, greater oversight, or if there is environmental regulations, companies that are private or foreign owned, they will only act within what regulations impose, or they can figure out how to get away from it, or they just see whatever penalty that you have for regulation as a cost of doing business. That is less likely to happen when a government is accountable politically, and they also have to care about the social impact that happens. Okay, let's move on to the second argument you can use. The second argument in support of nationalization is how you can eventually establish value for yourself. So first of all, if you have substantial amount of resources and the rest of the world has listened to you, then they need your exports more than you need them, because they need your exports in order for them to build more Teslas, whatever. Of course, this is a double-edged sword in the sense that, companies, if they were to go through the legal route, they will probably try to sort of like work with your state-owned enterprises or hope that they get concessions from these companies, and a lot of actions are being outsourced and they can continue. But the risk here is, of course, companies lobbying their governments and eventually encourage coups or support the opposition. You might argue that this is what happened to Venezuela in some sense, where they decided to prioritize or expropriate a lot of the assets from foreign companies that are involved in the oil industry. And a lot of American companies are not happy about that. And of course, there's a lot of other moral justifications, but it has led to sanctions because American companies are in support of this kind of things. And the American government would want to prioritize the interests of American companies in that case. And sanctions is the way to go in that sense. But anyway, so that is the risk when you use the argument about substantial needs when it comes to nationalization or whatever. But the whole point here is that, oh wait, I forgot. So there was this one time Elon Musk tweeted, I guess what he calls a joke, like, whatever. He did say that we will cool Bolivia, or we will cool whoever we want in order to gain access to certain markets, etc. Because Bolivia at one point wanted to nationalize the lithium industry, and Tesla, being an EV manufacturer, electric vehicle manufacturer, is very dependent on lithium. So if they can't have access to lithium, what do you think the elites would want to do? They would probably try to either capitulate to whatever the state-owned enterprises would allow them, or they would try to use dirty ways, supporting the opposition, coup, destabilization, sanctions, whatever. But anyway, if things go down the legal route and people are good, whatever, you are able to establish value, and that would eventually push you up the chain or the economic ladder in itself. But number two, you can move beyond raw natural resources. So for example, countries like Morocco earlier, rather than just exporting phosphate, they are able to turn that into fertilizer that everyone needs instead. So it forces countries to pay higher rather than rely on just an export. Of course, it's not exclusive to nationalization, but with nationalization, it's easier for you to do that because you don't have to worry about the interests of other nations. You can worry about your country first. But another thing, when you have like a greater control over your resources, that you can force manufacturers to be within your country and to push factories within it. For example, China does this a lot in the sense that, I mean, not explicitly, but China does it in the sense that they have a lot of natural resources like rare earth materials within their borders that other countries have realized that it's cheaper for them to just move their factories into China in order to be close to these natural resources rather than hoping that they are able to import those natural resources, because then they could reduce the cost, because there is so much control that the Chinese government has over these resources that this becomes a cost-saving measure itself. Of course, there are many other reasons why countries manufacture in China, and why it's that. But having control of the resources makes it easier for you to get people to stay there because they are not immediately exported abroad. But people have to build the value or transform that product into something valuable within the country itself, and then export something of a higher value, and then your GDP becomes higher, and you are not just exporting raw natural resource, but a more complex product, so value added on. So there is a perception your country is way more sophisticated than before, and you build the expertise surrounding it within it. So the value is within the country, not outside. And all these other extraction companies, they have loyalties outside, so they might care about that first. But local companies control that, then you control their resources. Then within that, you are able to build the related expertise within it, rather than relying on foreign experts all the time. Okay, so far I've spoken about nationalization in a good light. Let's talk about nationalization from the perspective of the opposition instead. So this is where recharacterization would help. You could try to recharacterize the interests of developing nations and also their capability. So far, a lot of the characterization we've used gives the benefit of the doubt that these developing nations are able to exploit their resources in the first place. Of course, when it comes to expropriation, you are able to use the industrial equipment that was left behind by companies that eventually left whatsoever. But the sobering reality is that, number one, you might not have the right investment to operate these machineries because you need to invest in the right people for this kind of things for it to eventually translate into something larger. Or number two, they might be outdated and you probably need something new, something way more sophisticated instead. Or probably you don't have the materials, or you don't have the equipment, machineries, because they brought back all of this home and you aren't able to use it, or you have to buy it off from them itself. And these developing nations won't be able to do that in itself. So this is where you don't have the capital to invest in natural resources. And all of this, again, is resource intensive, requires a lot of capital that these nations don't have in the first place. And there is a reason why foreign direct investment and eventually foreign ownership is important. Just because it's owned by foreign companies, it does not mean you don't actually get any benefit from these companies. They pour in money where you aren't able to spend in the first place. So if you are a poorer nation and you want to spend money on schools, you can do that because you sort of like allow private entities to take up the job of extracting resources, and that eventually allows you to do other things you need, etc. But the whole point here is that foreign direct investments and foreign ownership isn't 100% bad if it means that you are able to tap into a huge source of capital in that process. When you don't have the capital and you put a lot of capital into natural resource extraction, it normally means that other industries are also affected with it. But anyway, just because you force extractive companies to be nationalized in that process, it does not mean that the foreign companies that used to own all of this would just move into different industries and the economy gets balanced out. That is not a guarantee. There is a possibility that these foreign companies who were originally working within your industry, feeling that their property rights have been stepped on. So they have no idea if everything else will be respected. So let's say an oil company is also investing in, let's say, manufacturing in your country. They might want to reduce dependence because they have no idea if you're going to extend that nationalization into manufacturing or not. So this is where they start to decouple you between themselves and your country, and it makes it harder for you to attract more investors because they see this reaction from other countries and so on, whatsoever. So they have no idea how long they will own the company, so they may as well invest in other countries where their property rights are secured and respected. And they don't have to think too much about, well, I still have this country 2 years, this company 2 years down the road instead. So it makes it harder for these foreign companies to invest in your country. And it's even harder for you to diversify because you don't have all of this other capital. So you are back to relying or over-relying on the natural resource that you nationalize in the first place. Right. The second angle that you can deal with this, or you could argue against nationalism, is that the problem with nationalization at the end of the day is that you are still reliant on foreign markets. You are still reliant on whether other people will want to buy your products. So if people are not happy about your nationalization, and they feel as if their property rights have been infringed, it's easy for them to boycott or not do business with you. It's easy for them to do business with other people. And like I said, worst case scenario, they might tell their governments to, I don't know, sanction you, or this is what they disrespected when it comes to business in the first place, and so on. So you may gain control of the resource, but other people might realize that there are other options. So like I said earlier, Mexican oil at one point was boycotted because of the nationalization and the establishment of Pemex. And it's hard for them to sell that oil abroad. Like I said earlier, easy target for sanctions, a tool that can be used in foreign policy disputes. The third argument against nationalization is what we call the resource curse. So, or sometimes called the Dutch disease, because the Dutch were at one point over-reliant on the natural resource, and that eventually became the title of a book. I forgot who's the author, but they coined the term the Dutch disease, and I guess eventually we'll call it the resource curse in that sense. So the problem with nationalization, and if it's so substantial, is that there is a huge over-dependence on that resource. And if the whole point of your nationalization is for redistribution, for social welfare or whatever it is. It means that your whole nation and how they live and how they are able to grow economically um, is over dependent on that single industry. Put so much money into it. And like what I said earlier, if you are a developing nation with limited capital and resources, and you nationalize something that is substantial, thinking that this is where most of your income comes from, most of your industry will be centered around these resources, or you might have other smaller industries that service this larger natural resource extraction industry instead. So a lot of people would want to work within these industries because it becomes part of their identity. Over-reliant people think that's where jobs are in itself. And a lot of politics is surrounded around these resources. Let's go back to Malaysia and talk about Malaysia. And the politics around Malaysia is very centered around what can Petronas do? How much money can we take out of Petronas? How much can we squeeze out of Petronas instead? And a lot of the political bickering isn't about diversifying the economy, but more like to what control should we have over Petronas? Should Petronas be a private company and so on? Should we privatize certain things and so on? Is nationalization far enough in all of this? And a lot of money goes into it. Everyone is quite reliant, becomes heavily politicized throughout the process. The next problem when it comes to the resource curse is that it might lead to market inefficiency. So how does this happen? Now, if you were to take a look at a private landscape, when you have foreign direct investment, it's not just going to be one company that enters your market if it is up for grabs. Of course, they would fight tooth and nail to have control, but you would have Shell, you would have BP, and all of the other oil companies, they might be fighting over things. And in order for them to be profitable, they eventually need to compete and somehow they are able to undercut the costs of other people and so on. But if you only have one entity running things, the state-owned enterprise, and the main goal is not efficiency or profit, this would eventually lead to inefficiency, and they have no incentive to improve quickly because they're not competing. Everything is stable, their jobs are stable. I can empathize with that situation. I can imagine why someone would think like that. But that stability would normally mean that they would not be on the cutting edge of things. That stability would eventually lead to them being complacent. And let's say if they are working on extracting oil within it, they might not figure out the most effective way to turn that into a different product. They might not care too much about liquefied natural gas because they can just export it and that's good enough, that makes enough money already. And it has no guarantee you would have the added value on top of it because there is no real incentive of it, within it. I'm not saying that everyone will automatically become lazy. It's just that it's the easier thing for them to do at that moment. And they don't, and it takes a really long time for them to evolve because they don't have the capital in the first place for them to evolve and play catch up with other companies that are able to spend a lot of money when it comes to research and development. The next layer to this is that there is no guarantee that a nation would develop talent. Like I said earlier, if there is a concentration within these economies, other parts of the economy, if they don't diversify, would die out. And also at the same time, they won't make those talents as sophisticated it might be, and then they would leave the country. For example, let's take, for example, Brunei. Brunei is over-reliant on oil. And the only talent that they develop or put in most of their money into is into the oil and gas industry. So other people who would like to develop their careers, they will move to Malaysia, they will move to Singapore, they will move to Indonesia, or they will move to China instead, because these are the only places that are able to provide them a pathway for their career, or they feel as if that it's an easier time because the economy in other countries are way more diversified. Because once a country nationalize, they have that sunk cost fallacy, thinking that they are able to, so they should double down on what they have and they put all their money within it. So it means lack of investment in other things. The money should go to the priority. We've already nationalized and antagonized people. Let's keep with that. If you want to diversify, you have to go somewhere else and figure things out instead. Which then leads to one of the more intuitive arguments, is that this allows for room for corruption, because it's a business of access, as in, like, you need access to something to do business. So let's say, for example, if you are a company that is given monopoly over something, and other companies are fighting for the license for extraction or to carry out the work that you have. And over-realize, when most of the economy is within that and people become desperate, this is where corruption happens, because they want to get into it and they will find any way they want to get into it. But also at the same time, it is easy money for people on top, because this is the only thing that has been invested in and there's been control, and so on. So corruption happens on a larger level in that sense. Okay, so those are the different kinds of arguments that we can sort of like go through with this motion instead. Right, so that's it for an exploration of this topic. We can go back to the main general questions itself, and we could have like a brief Q&A about the topic in general from it after this.